Welcome to our deep dive into the world where neuroscience and oneness kind of collide.
Yeah.
We're going to be exploring how our brains actually shape how we see ourselves, reality, and even spirituality.
Hmm.
So think of this as a crash course on how your brain constructs your experience of the world,
Right.
which leads to some pretty big questions about who we are, what's real, and how it all connects.
You got it.
So we're using this essay, The Neuroscientific Basis of Oneness, as our kind of framework,
Yeah.
but we're weaving in a bunch of different voices and sources along the way.
Yeah, exactly. We'll
Yeah.
be pulling from scientific studies like what we find in the embodied mind, philosophical stuff from principles of neurotheology.
Right.
And we've even got some personal accounts of people who felt this sense of oneness firsthand.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to bring in those real experiences too,
Absolutely. And don't forget how God changes your brain. We'll touch on some interesting points from there as well.
Definitely. Okay, so before we jump into brain waves and mystical states, let's start with a super simple question. What does oneness actually mean?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a word you see everywhere, from ancient philosophy to modern science, but it can change depending on who's using it.
Right, exactly.
Even in the sources we're looking at, it takes on different meanings. Like in Buddhist tradition, it's all about letting go of the idea of the separate self and experiencing a state of non-duality. But then cognitive science comes in and asks, well, is our sense of self really one thing, or is it a bunch of processes working together?
Yeah, like how does the brain actually create that feeling of me?
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting when you consider how people describe mystical experiences. You know, those moments when they feel boundaries disappear and merge with something bigger than themselves.
Yeah, like they're suddenly tapped into a different channel of reality.
That's it. And that's where neurotheology comes in, trying to figure out if our brains are wired for these experiences of unity and connection. Could it be that our brains can perceive not just separate things, but also how everything is connected?
That's a pretty wild thought.
Right.
It makes you question what reality really is.
Right.
Okay, but let's switch gears a bit and talk about mindfulness and selflessness. The excerpt from the Embodied Mind really digs into mindfulness meditation
Oh, yeah.
and these practices called shamatha and vipassana.
Think of shamatha as calming the mind, like stilling a choppy lake.
Yeah.
And then vipassana is about developing insight, seeing things as they really are. Basically, you're training your attention to be present in the moment and observe your thoughts and feelings without being carried away by them.
It sounds like mental training for a more grounded experience. But does science actually back this up?
It does. Neuroscience shows us that these mindfulness practices can literally change how your brain is structured,
Wow.
especially the areas related to attention, controlling your emotions, and self-awareness. And guess what? This connects directly to the Buddhist idea of no self.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying mindfulness can change our brains and maybe even loosen the grip of our egos?
That's what the research is pointing to. Mindfulness helps us see how our thoughts and feelings are always changing, not permanent, which weakens that sense of a solid me.
So it's like a hack for rewiring our brains to be less ego-driven. That's fascinating.
Right.
But if our brains are so changeable, if things like mindfulness can reshape them, what does that tell us about the nature of reality itself? Is it all just a product of our brains?
Ooh, great question. And that takes us right to the heart of what oneness might mean. You see, a big takeaway from all these sources is that our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world, crafting stories and looking for meaning, even when there might not be any.
Right, like in How God Changes Your Brain, where they talk about how our brains each build our understanding of God in our own unique ways.
Exactly. It highlights how even our most spiritual experiences are filtered through our individual brain biology.
So even our beliefs about God are shaped by how our brains work.
To some extent, yeah. What's important to understand is that your brain is a meaning-making machine. It evolved to create order out of chaos, constantly looking for patterns and explanations. So even your beliefs, those core assumptions you have about the world, are rooted in how your brain is wired.
So we've got our brains making meaning, shaping our perception of reality, and even influencing our spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
But are we saying there's no objective truth out there, that it's all just in our heads?
That's the big question, isn't it? And to really unpack that, we have to delve into how Principles of Neurotheology describes the different ways our brains perceive the world. Ready for a deep dive into primary epistemic states?
Let's do it. Hit me with the brain science.
Okay, so these primary epistemic states are basically like different modes of perception.
Okay.
Each one showing us a unique side of reality.
Okay.
Like sometimes your brain's focused on individual objects,
Yeah.
creating these clear boundaries between things. But then other times it shifts to emphasize the relationships and the connections between those things.
Yeah.
And then there are even states where you get the sense of absolute unity, where everything just kind of blends together into this one interconnected whole.
Whoa. So which of these states is the true reality then?
Right.
Are we just flipping between different versions of the world depending on how our brains are working at any given moment?
That's where it gets really fascinating. Principles of neurotheology suggest that all of these states are actually valid experiences.
Mm.
It's kind of like, your brain has different lenses it can use to see the world, and each lens reveals a different aspect of reality. It's not that one is right and the others are wrong, but rather that each one offers a unique perspective.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all relates back to the idea of oneness.
Yeah.
If our brains can actually experience this feeling of unity, this interconnectedness, then maybe it's not so crazy to think that there's a deeper reality beyond our everyday perception of just separate objects and individuals.
Exactly. But here's the thing. How do we know if these experiences are actually real or just illusions created by our brains?
Right.
It's a question that's been around for ages.
Yeah.
Philosophers, scientists, they've been wrestling with it for centuries.
Well, real or not, the fact that our brains can even have these experiences of oneness is pretty amazing.
It is.
It suggests that maybe we're not as limited by our physical brains as we think we are.
Right.
But, if our brains are so powerful, are we just stuck in this brain in a vat scenario?
Oh, the classic thought experiment.
Where we can't really know what's real outside of our own minds?
Well, that's where the embodied mind brings in a different viewpoint.
Okay.
It emphasizes that your understanding of the world isn't just happening inside your head. It's actually being created through your physical interactions with your environment. This is what they call inaction.
So it's not just our brains passively receiving information, but our whole bodies engaging with the world, and that shapes how we see things.
Right, exactly.
That makes sense. Like, imagine walking through a forest.
Okay, yeah.
Your experience isn't just a picture in your mind, right?
Yeah.
It's the feel of the ground under your feet, the smell of the trees, the sounds of the birds. It's a full-body experience.
Precisely. Your brain and body are working together to create this dynamic, interactive experience of reality. It's not just a brain in a vat passively processing data.
Right.
It's an embodied being actively creating meaning through its interactions with the world.
Okay, so our understanding of oneness goes beyond just what's happening in our brains. It's about recognizing how connected we are to our environment and to each other.
Yeah.
This reminds me of something we talked about earlier, free will. If our brains are constructing our reality, making choices, shaping our beliefs, do we actually have any say in who we are and what we do?
The age-old question. We could spend hours unpacking the nuances of free will, but what we can focus on here is the potential for transformation that comes with understanding how our brains work.
Transformation. What do you mean?
Think about it. If you know how your brain works, especially its habit of finding patterns and creating stories, you become more aware of the hidden biases and assumptions that might be influencing how you see things. That awareness can be incredibly empowering.
So instead of feeling trapped by our brains, we can actually use this knowledge to make more conscious choices and shape our own experiences.
Exactly. Like knowing that mindfulness can actually change the structure of your brain gives you the power to choose practices that cultivate more peace and well-being. It's like taking control of your own mental and emotional world.
So by understanding our brains, we can sort of hack the system and create experiences that align with who we want to be.
Yeah, like unlocking hidden potential within ourselves.
That's powerful. But how does compassion fit into all of this?
Oh, that's a key piece of the puzzle. Compassion is all about recognizing our shared humanity.
Oh.
Understanding that we're all interconnected, that our well-being is intertwined. When you cultivate compassion, you're nurturing that sense of oneness that extends beyond just yourself.
This reminds me of how God Changes Your Brain talks about the neurological benefits of compassion. They mention how acts of kindness actually release all these beneficial chemicals in the brain, like dopamine and oxytocin.
Exactly. It's like our brains are wired for connection, for
Yeah.
caring for others.
It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective too, right?
It does. Humans are social creatures. We thrive on cooperation.
So it's not just about personal growth,
Yeah.
but actually contributing to a more compassionate world.
Absolutely. And that brings us right back to the transformative power of understanding our brains. When you see how interconnected we truly are, how your thoughts, feelings, and actions impact others, it can inspire you to live in a more compassionate and ethical way.
It's like that idea from the embodied mind about how understanding the impermanence of our experience can actually lead to a sense of liberation and openness.
Exactly. It's like by letting go of that tight grip on a fixed sense of self, you open yourself up to a wider range of experiences, deeper connections, greater empathy, and a more expansive sense of who you are.
This deep dive has been incredible so far. We've covered how our brains create reality, the transformative power of compassion.
It's been quite a journey.
And now I'm really curious to explore this connection between all of this and the idea of flow. Remember that book we mentioned, Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience?
Oh, yeah.
What's the link between flow states and this whole idea of oneness?
Flow is fascinating, and it's more connected to oneness than you might think. Have you ever been so engrossed in something
Yeah.
that you completely lose track of time? Your sense of self fades away, and you're just totally absorbed in the present moment.
Oh, absolutely. It happens to me when I'm writing, playing music, even in a really good conversation.
Yeah.
Worries disappear, and I'm just completely in the zone.
That's the hallmark of a flow state. Mihaly, Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who came up with the term,
Yeah.
he described it as this state of optimal experience, characterized by intense focus, effortless control, and this merging of action and awareness.
So it's like being totally present, immersed in what you're doing, without distractions or self-consciousness holding you back.
Exactly.
Does that mean flow states are like a secular path to experiencing oneness?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? It's a really interesting question. Isn't it Csikszentmihalyi himself called flow, a state of transcendence? A way to step outside our usual egocentric perspective,
Right.
to tap into a deeper level of experience. And when you really think about it,
Yeah.
both flow states and those mystical experiences of oneness have some pretty striking similarities.
Now that you mention it,
Yeah.
there are some parallels.
Yes.
In both cases, you have that dissolving of boundaries, a sense of the ego kind of fading away,
Yeah.
and this feeling of deep connection and unity with something bigger.
Exactly. In those moments of flow, your attention is so absorbed in the activity
Right.
that the usual mental chatter just quiets down. There's no room for self-doubt or worries or distractions, just pure focused presence. It's like you've momentarily transcended those limitations of your ego
Yeah.
and tapped into a more expansive state of awareness.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
But if flow states can give us a taste of this oneness, is there a way to actually cultivate them intentionally? Or do we just have to wait for them to kind of happen randomly?
Well, while there's definitely some spontaneity to flow,
Yeah?
Csikszentmihalyi's research actually suggests that there are certain conditions that make it more likely to occur. Remember, it's all about finding that sweet spot where you're engaged and challenged, but not totally overwhelmed.
So you're saying it's about finding the right balance between skill and challenge.
Exactly.
It's like when you're playing a video game,
Oh, yeah. Good example.
you've got a clear goal. You're getting constant feedback on how you're doing,
Uh-huh.
and you're completely immersed in the challenge.
You've hit on some of the key ingredients of flow right there. Having those clear goals, getting immediate feedback,
Yeah.
and being engaged in an activity that stretches your abilities without being too frustrating.
Okay.
Those all help to create those magical moments of flow.
So it's not about forcing ourselves to focus, but finding those activities that we really connect with.
Exactly.
The ones where we lose track of time and just get completely absorbed.
Yeah, it's not about willpower. It's about finding those activities that really resonate with who you are at your core. The ones that allow you to tap into your full potential.
This has been an amazing journey. We've explored how our brains build our reality,
It has.
the power of compassion,
Yeah.
and the incredible potential of flow states.
Yeah.
It feels like we've only just begun to explore this whole idea of oneness.
We have. And the exciting part is that the exploration doesn't have to stop here. There's so much more to discover
Right.
at this intersection of neuroscience and spirituality and human experience.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, I'd love to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question to ponder.
Okay.
If our brains are wired for connection, for oneness, for transcendence, what does that really tell us about what humans are capable of? What could we achieve if we tap into this natural capacity for unity and interconnectedness?
That's a beautiful question.
Yeah.
And it's one that each of us can explore in our own unique ways. The insights we get from neurotheology, they
Yeah.
suggest that we're not just isolated individuals, but interconnected beings capable of these profound experiences of unity and transcendence. And maybe, just maybe, those experiences hold the key to unlocking a more compassionate, a more fulfilling, and a more interconnected way of being in the world.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the neuroscience of oneness.
That's been a pleasure.
We hope you've gained some new insights and are leaving with a sense of wonder and curiosity about the incredible potential that we all have within us.
Remember, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of your own experience. You never know what incredible insights and transformations might be waiting for you.
Until next time, happy deep diving.